More than 1 million people have now signed a petition to stop Donald Trump's state visit to the UK. Momentum has grown since the US president announced a clampdown on immigration over the weekend. Following the executive order, the American embassy in London has now told citizens of the 7 countries affected not to apply for visas to the States. Donald Trump says only 109 people were detained over the weekend, and airport problems were caused by computer issues and protesters, not his travel ban. We'll have the latest from Washington and from Westminster, where the Foreign Secretary will address Parliament this afternoon. Also this lunchtime, 6 people are shot dead at a mosque near Quebec City. Canada's Prime Minister calls it a terrorist attack against Muslims. Theresa May holds talks with political leaders from Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland on her Brexit strategy. Identified at last, the American with dementia found 2 years ago lost in Hereford with no ID. He'd been abandoned by his family. And mapping the mood of urban Britain, we hear from the man who's walked more than 1,000 miles to do so.
Here, the home care companies not being paid enough. A BBC investigation finds they're pulling out of council deals and slipping deeper into debt. Figures show the number of people with financial troubles has doubled in a decade.
Good afternoon and welcome to the BBC News at 1. More than 1 million people have now signed a petition calling on the government to cancel a planned state visit to the UK by Donald Trump. It follows his temporary ban on visitors from 7 predominantly Muslim countries from entering the USA. The Labour leader, Jeremy Corbyn, said the visit should be postponed, but Downing Street said scrapping the visit would undo everything achieved in Mrs May's visit to Washington earlier this month and called the campaign a populist gesture. Here's our political correspondent, Ian Watson.
No fascist USA!
The demonstrations in America against President Trump's imposition of a temporary travel ban are likely to be repeated here, with protests planned outside Downing Street later today and in other UK cities. Although the Foreign Office have clarified that British citizens are exempt from the ban, the Foreign Secretary has been under pressure to say why it took so long to get clarification.
I'll be talking to you in the House of Commons.
OK.
That's the place. House of Commons. Be there.
This Conservative MP was born in Iraq, one of the 7 countries which are subject to President Trump's travel ban. He's pleased with confirmation now that as a British citizen he'll be able to visit the USA, but he's still opposed to the policy.
Clearly, the Foreign Secretary had worked throughout Sunday and into the night, talking directly to the White House, was my understanding, as did the team at Number 10, and I applaud them for the work they did, certainly on behalf of families like mine. I mean, the anguish we suffered over the last 72 hours has been horrific. There are millions of people in the UK and in the rest of Europe who are dual nationals or originally nationals of those countries who will be worried.
And now more than 1 million people have signed an online petition calling for President Trump's planned state visit to the UK to be called off. They say it could embarrass the Queen. That's the second highest number of signatories since the current policy on petitions was introduced. But it's worth noting that almost 500,000 people signed a petition backing a policy similar to Donald Trump's, calling for an immigration ban until ISIS is defeated. When a petition gets more than 100,000 signatures, MPs must consider it for debate. A decision on that will be taken tomorrow, but parliamentary sources are stressing it would be inconceivable if President Trump's planned visit wasn't discussed here at Westminster. Now, even if a majority of MPs decided they wanted that visit scrapped, they couldn't rescind an invitation from Buckingham Palace and Downing Street, but they could embarrass the Prime Minister.
Prime Minister, should President Trump's state visit go ahead?
She was tight-lipped today, but Downing Street have made it clear it would be a populist gesture to scrap President Trump's invitation, and they don't intend to do so. But the Labour leader wanted her to think again.
I think it's right that I should make the position very, very clear on the views that I have on the proposed state visit by President Trump, which is that it should be postponed, and that we should make that position very, very clear. And in view of the number of people that have come out over the last 2 days, I think a very substantial number of the British public absolutely agree with me on that.
But this former party leader defended Donald Trump.
And what has happened here is the countries upon which Trump has put a temporary travel ban while they work out how they're going to put extreme vetting in place. That list was drawn up by the Obama administration.
What was a diplomatic success now looks like a political difficulty. Getting close to the new US administration could be good for the post-Brexit economy, but not necessarily for Theresa May's domestic popularity. Ian Watson, BBC News.
Well, our assistant political editor, Norman Smith, is in Westminster. 1.2 million people have signed this petition now. How much pressure does that put the Prime Minister under?
A lot, and what a contrast, you have to say, to just a couple of days ago when Number 10 were congratulating themselves on the outcome of those talks with Donald Trump. Now we've got this petition of more than 1 million. You've got Labour accusing Mrs May of, quotes, appeasement. The Liberal Democrat leader similarly critical. We've got Tory MPs critical, and we may get a debate and possibly even a vote in the House of Commons this afternoon on Mr Trump's travel ban. Now, to date, Number 10 are resisting all calls to withdraw the offer of a state visit. But you sense they're just trying to minimise the potential damage by suggesting this lunchtime that the decision to go ahead with the offer of the state visit came from a committee in the Foreign Office. Secondly, confusion this morning over the reassurances obtained by Boris Johnson over the weekend about the impact of the travel ban on British dual nationals, with the US Embassy in London telling dual nationals here, don't bother applying for a visa, you won't get one. Now, the Foreign Office say they are hopeful that advice will be reviewed. But you just think, Sophie, Mrs May is between a rock and a hard place. She desperately wants good relations with the new US administration. She sees it as part of our long-term strategic interest. But those ties with Donald Trump are already causing her difficulty, and she knows some of Mr Trump's attitudes and policies, yes, are profoundly objectionable to many people in Britain and indeed in her own party.
Norman Smith, thank you. Well, this morning, President Trump has said only 109 people out of more than 300,000 were detained at immigration for questioning over the weekend, and that the big problems at airports were caused by computer issues and protesters, not his travel ban. Protests have continued across America, and many more are being planned here in the UK this evening in around 30 towns and cities. In Iraq, one of the 7 countries whose citizens are now temporarily banned, the parliament has voted to retaliate by introducing a similar ban on Americans entering the country for 90 days. Daniel Bircher has the latest.
You don't tolerate Christianity! You don't tolerate us!
This is how divisive the issue has become. Shouted arguments between opponents of Donald Trump's travel ban and those supporting it. This protest is in Portland, but they have continued in many US cities and at several airports where there is still confusion about how the president's order should be implemented. There have also been a number of legal challenges.
Protection of the nation from foreign terrorists.
The executive order suspends the entry of nationals from 7 Muslim-majority countries. It stops the US refugee program for 4 months, and there's an indefinite ban on all Syrian refugees. That's a concern for Abdul Shatat, a refugee from Homs who settled in California. He had hoped that his wider family could be reunited, but fears that won't happen now.
We hope things go back to how they were and that these orders are eased, because our people have suffered. Our people are not troublemakers and there's nothing wrong with us. It's just that history has dealt us a difficult hand.
There have been protests against the policy in a number of countries. Here, students in the Philippines, and the Iraqi parliament has voted to ask its government to retaliate against the US. Canada has offered to give temporary residency to people stranded in the country by the ban.
We will continue to ensure that our immigration system is about compassion, efficiency, and economic opportunity, and the protection of the health, safety, and security of Canadians.
The UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, Zeid Ra'ad Al Hussein, said in a tweet that discrimination on nationality alone was forbidden under human rights law. He added the US ban is also mean-spirited and wastes resources needed for proper counter-terrorism. While here, a former MI6 head of counter-terrorism said the measures could do more harm than good.
This sort of ban on travel makes a huge impact around the world and rather feeds the narrative of extremist Islamist terrorists that you know, the Americans and all the allies are fundamentally against us because of our religion.
But President Trump's aides insist this is not about religion, but about tackling terrorism, and that the order is an interim measure while new policies are drawn up. And his supporters argue it is necessary.
Whatever needs to be done has to be done. And this is for the safety of everybody.
Donald Trump said that this is temporary, so I trust him. His number one job is to protect the American people, and I think he's doing it.
We live in a country of democracy, and if the majority of the people feel that they are threatened and they want to have things in place, then we should be able to have things in place.
Donald Trump said only 109 out of 325,000 people were detained and held for questioning following his executive order, and tweeted that the Homeland Security Secretary, John Kelly, said that all was going well with very few problems. Daniel Bircher, BBC News.
Well, let's speak to our Washington correspondent, Kim Hattas. Despite the protests then, President Trump remains defiant.
He certainly does, although, of course, after having chosen decisive action over deliberate process, he has faced a lot of criticism for that and protest across the country and confusion and chaos at airports, as we saw over the last few days. Now, the White House did pull back just a little bit, saying, for example, that green card holders, permanent residents in the United States, will not be affected by this ban. There is still some confusion about dual citizens, French, Syrians or Iranian, British, etc., whether they will be allowed to come into the country. It seems for now not. But it has caused a lot of confusion and chaos also for international organizations that are based here in the United States. The United Nations, the IMF, the World Bank. What we also heard from the White House is that they are trying to temper a little bit the tone that they have used. The executive order came on Friday, but by Sunday we had a statement from President Trump saying that he stood by it, but that this was not a Muslim ban, despite what the media, as he said, was falsely reporting. He did try to emphasize that he was a compassionate man, but that the key was to keep the country safe, to keep terror out. And that is what appeals to Donald Trump's supporters. And a poll this morning shows that 48% of Americans support a travel ban if it keeps terror out. And if you use that phrasing, then you will get support. But of course, the criticism is there as well.
Kim, thank you. Canada's Prime Minister Justin Trudeau says the fatal shooting at a mosque in the city of Quebec was a terrorist attack against Muslims. 6 people were killed and 8 were wounded. Police have arrested 2 men in connection with the killings. Andy Moore has this report, which does contain some flash photography.
Police closed off the area surrounding the cultural centre as armed officers entered the mosque. It was during evening prayers on Sunday. Witnesses say gunmen opened fire on more than 50 worshippers inside. Some of those wounded are said to be seriously injured. Quebec City Police confirmed that 2 suspects had been arrested. They called it an act of terror. The Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau said in a statement, "We condemn this terrorist attack on Muslims in a centre of worship and refuge." He went on, "Muslim Canadians are an important part of our national fabric, and these senseless acts have no place in our communities." Quebec's Premier said the Canadian people categorically rejected what he called this barbaric violence.
I want to say a few words to our fellow Quebecers, Muslim Quebecers. We are with you. This is your home. You're welcome here. We are all Quebecers. We should work together and strive to build together a society which will be even more open, peaceful too, even in this troubled world.
Last year, a pig's head was left in front of the mosque, but local people said there was usually a spirit of tolerance.
In terms of the Quebecois that I have encountered, I never have encountered any sort of hatred or animosity towards them, so I'm really shocked by all of this.
I just can't imagine awful things like that happening in here, where I imagine most of the people are respectful.
Solidarity rallies are planned across Quebec today. Andy Moore, BBC News.
Theresa May is meeting political leaders from Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland today to discuss Britain's exit from the European Union. The talks are taking place in Cardiff. Our political correspondent Vicky Young is there. And what are these talks expected to achieve, Vicky?
Well, Theresa May promised that the devolved administrations of the United Kingdom would be fully involved in the run-up to Brexit. Now, since then, of course, we've had a Supreme Court ruling which says that Scotland and the Scottish Parliament do not have a veto over this process. But what's given added spice, really, to the talks here today is Theresa May's speech where she said categorically that she felt that the UK would be leaving the single market. Now, the Scottish leader, Nicola Sturgeon, is appalled by that. She thinks it would be catastrophic for jobs, and today they've been discussing a paper about how Scotland and Wales could stay in the single market even if the rest of the United Kingdom were to leave. Now, the SNP have said so far they've been very disappointed by the talks that have gone on in these sessions over the last few months. They don't think that the United Kingdom government is listening, although Theresa May says she is determined to get a solution which will be welcomed by everybody in all parts of the United Kingdom. But it does feel very difficult to see how there could be any compromise over this issue of Britain remaining in the single market. I think it's more likely that the SNP, with their MPs joining together with Labour in the House of Commons and the Liberal Democrats as they start debating that Article 50 bill, they may there, of course, try to get some changes to that and some of the compromises that they're looking for.
Vicky, thank you. The time is just after 1:15, our top story this lunchtime. A petition calling for President Trump's state visit to the UK to be called off has now topped more than 1.2 million signatures. And coming up,
for years, we journalists have sold our energy stories under the headline that the lights might go out. From today, Blackout Britain should be no more.
And in South today, the home care companies not being paid enough. A BBC investigation finds they're pulling out of council deals. And the tattoo artist overwhelmed by demand after offering to help women who've had breast cancer surgery.
As US embassies begin implementing President Trump's travel ban on citizens from 7 predominantly Muslim countries, companies in America are warning staff who could be affected to cancel any travel plans in case they're not allowed back into the US. America's high-tech industries have been particularly vocal. Many are concerned that in future they'll be stopped from recruiting the best foreign-based entrepreneurs. From California, here's our technology correspondent Dave Lee.
Passengers arriving at San Francisco International Airport are being given a hero's welcome, doing something which just a week ago was nothing out of the ordinary. As in other parts of the country, it's the airport here that has become the focal point of protests over President Trump's immigration policies. Google founder Sergey Brin was among the crowds waiting at arrivals. And as public opinion began to swell, it was Google's current chief executive who began the wave of big tech companies lashing out at President Trump's order. It's painful to see the personal cost, he said, adding that more than 100 of his staff were directly affected. Other companies quickly chimed in. Real and upsetting, said Twitter. Misguided, said Microsoft. And Apple's boss said it was not a policy we support. The shock here is the speed at which President Trump's policies have impacted business.
Oftentimes we think about a policy that is passed and that has an impact, but it's not super immediate. It might, the impact may not be felt for another few months or even a year later or something like that. And this is something where people are being stopped at the airport now.
When the best engineers and developers arrive in Silicon Valley, this is where they start. And the message from protesters today is that those people are still welcome. And the message from the tech giants is that those people are still needed.
Our companies fundamentally rely on bringing together talent from everywhere, and any risk to that, we think would be disastrous to our economy.
The good thing about the ultrasonics is they can see even soft objects.
On Friday, tech bosses, including Tesla's chief executive Elon Musk, are meeting with President Trump. A chance, Mr. Musk said, to raise his concerns in person. In the meantime, tech companies and other wealthy individuals here have pledged millions of dollars in funding for organisations fighting back against President Trump's most impactful decisions so far. Dave Lee, BBC News, San Francisco.
From next winter, the UK will have enough secure energy supplies to meet demand, according to the man who ran the national grid for a decade. Steve Holliday says firing up old gas and coal plants when demand is at its highest will make up any shortfall, and that fears of a blackout Britain are unjustified. Here's our environment analyst, Roger Harrabin.
In the kitchen, in the living room, in the office. We all need to know the power won't go off. In hospitals, electricity is literally a life support. That's why hospitals have their own backup generators in case of a power cut. But what about the rest of us? Wind power is almost free when the wind blows. When it doesn't, that creates a potential gap in electricity supplies. Under a new scheme from next winter, firms owning old power stations will get subsidies to keep them on standby in case of a power shortage.
The government have run auctions to make sure there's enough capacity generating electricity for the next 4 winters. So right through to 2021, we know we've got more than enough power to meet all our supplies in the UK. And beyond that, the systems will be cleverer. So we should just stop worrying about blackouts.
The new system will unquestionably help keep the lights on. The question is at what cost? And that looks like it could be several billions of pounds per year on consumer bills.
The government says that's an exaggeration. It's likely to cost households £7 a year on bills, reducing to £2 a year as smart energy takes over, they say. This is the future of electricity. Giant batteries like this near Leighton Buzzard, smoothing out troughs in power production. Electricity will be used more flexibly too. In Cornwall, households are already benefiting from cheap power to do the washing when the sun shines and there's plenty of solar electricity. Big firms like this one near Heathrow are getting paid to turn off their power use at times of peak demand as part of the smart energy revolution. For years, we journalists have sold our energy stories under the headline that the lights might go out. From today, Blackout Britain should be no more. Roger Harrabin, BBC News.
MPs are holding an inquiry into what's known as fake news, the sort of false information spread via social media. Members of the Culture, Media and Sports Select Committee are concerned that it represents a threat to democracy. Our media editor, Amal Rajan, is here. Just explain how big a problem fake news is.
It's worth bearing in mind, Sophie, it's not actually that big a problem. So fake news is driven by the news agenda. So when Donald Trump was running for office in America, there were huge numbers of people sharing fake news. There was quite a bit around the European referendum here last year. But in the UK, fake news is a tiny fraction of a percentage of the total material shared on social media. It's just that some fake news stories are so salacious and so astonishing, like the idea that Denzel Washington backed Trump or the Pope backed Trump, that they achieve huge renown. So it's not a huge issue, but it's probably worth doing something about it, and that's why these MPs are going to have a look at it.
What realistically can they do about it?
Realistically, these MPs are going to make recommendations to government, and the government could put pressure on tech companies to make it easier to flag fake news. Realistically, I don't think, because news is global, it's not something that belongs to a particular domain, there's not a great deal that government can do. But tech companies like Facebook could make it easier for you to flag fake news. So if you see something that looks suspicious, you can say, hang on a second, I'm not sure about that. In Germany and America, they're employing independent fact checkers to say, hang on, this stuff doesn't look completely right. And Google has said that they will make it harder for people to make money out of fake news. But truth be told, when you have people that want to advance a particular political agenda, it's always going to be with us. And I fear with Donald Trump tweeting about it, fake news is going to be with us for quite some time to come.
Amal, thank you. In November 2015, an elderly man was found lost wandering around a car park in Hereford. Ever since then, great efforts have been made to find out who he is, and now the BBC's Panorama team have traced him to a suburb of Los Angeles and discovered that his wife and his son had flown him to England and then abandoned him. Dara McIntyre has this report.
This thing is really a fire. Look at that fire.
This man was found in Hereford in November 2015 with no ID and no idea of where he came from.
Yeah, thank you, him.
Yeah, that's good.
Everyone called him Roger because he once said the name Roger Curry, but the police didn't know if that was his real name.
We have a person, we have a possible name, but nothing else. We have got no identity documents, no indication of where he's from.
Roger has dementia and couldn't help. You speak with an accent from America. Are you American?
5.
When we visited him last March, he'd already been in a local care home for 4 months. What happens if he is identified and he has to leave here?
It'll be devastating. But then, you know, because the staff, we've adopted him. And for Roger, it's wonderful, but, you know, he's become our Roger and, yeah.
The breakthrough came with this picture from a 1958 American high school yearbook. It featured an 18-year-old Roger Curry from the far northwest of the US. The likeness was striking. Panorama followed the lead and traced the teenager pictured in the yearbook to a current address in Los Angeles. The home was burnt out and looked abandoned, but neighbours knew Roger. Can I show you these photographs?
That's Roger. No
You sure?
question. Oh, no question about it. No doubt.
100%.
I am 100% sure that's Roger.
We had finally identified Roger Curry, but this story doesn't have a happy ending. We found that the family had been haunted by illness and trouble. It soon became clear that the 76-year-old had been deliberately abandoned in England. His son, Kevin, flew him to Britain. Kevin, we need to find out what happened to your dad. Kevin, did you dump your father in England? Kevin?
You're trespassing. You need to leave.
Kevin then agreed to answer questions, but not on camera. He says that he had nothing to do whatsoever with the abandonment of his father in England. He said his father became ill when they were visiting England on holiday, and that he asked a friend to take him to hospital. His explanation made no sense. Why did he leave his father in England for 8 months? After we notified the police about Roger Curry's identity, he was flown back to America last July. He is now in the care of the LA authorities. Dara McIntyre, BBC News.
And you can watch Panorama, The Mystery of the Unknown Man, tonight on BBC One at 8:30. Now, how do you feel about your hometown or city? Do you love it, or do you wish that you could live somewhere else? Well, for 6 months, one man has been crisscrossing the UK, making a mood map of urban Britain. 1,000 miles later, Dan Raven Ellison has collected information it's hoped will show how landscape influences our mood, our health and happiness, and how technology can improve our quality of life. Our correspondent David Silito caught up with him.
Meet Dan. He's an explorer of urban Britain. 2.5 million steps, 69 cities he's crossed, and on every step, this has tracked his emotions.
This is an emotive EEG wearable headset with a series of sensors that are able to detect what's going on inside my brain and can work out if I'm stressed, relaxed, focused, interested.
And so we agreed to meet in the city that registered high on the interest scale.
So the place you've brought me to is...
Stoke.
OK, convince me. We'll go for a walk.
Yes, this is urban Stoke. It's actually an old spoil heap that's now a park. And as we walked, it was a chance to discuss the other cities he'd crossed.
Exciting.
Bristol.
Swansea.
Do you know what? Swansea is the brunt of so many jokes, but my experience was just a flow of woodland going alongside the city, gorgeous hill, wonderful sea, street art.
Southampton.
Wild. Surprisingly wild. The far north of Southampton in suburbia, more birdsong, any other part of the UK I visited maybe.
Newcastle?
Just so many children. Loads of children playing out.
That's unusual,
Having
isn't it?
walked across all the cities in the UK, it is unusual to see children playing out.
Birmingham.
Far greener than you'd imagine. I love Dudley.
Dudley? Have a look at this map of the green space in and around Wolverhampton and Dudley. This is Swansea. And this, the 6 towns of Stoke-on-Trent, where we met up with some ramblers to see if they were feeling what Dan was feeling.
Yeah, we are starting to do more urban walks. People who live in the area are proud of being here.
For me, what's brilliant about walking across a city, especially a city like Stoke, is that from the bricks to the graffiti, to the bridges, to the trees, to the lichen, to the flats. There's so much interest going on. There's so much to enjoy every step along the way.
Do you agree? Oh yes, the diversity of the place is tremendous.
The ambition is to add other people's emotional responses to try to create a mood map of our cities. But so far we have Dan's data, which reveals that things like this excite him, and one particular thing appalls him.
I would speak to people about not putting dog poo in bags and then adorning trees at head height with those bags. You know, you put the dog poo in the bag, you take the bag away with you.
Is it?
It's all over the country.
And with that thought, we came to the end of this emotional journey across urban Britain. And the final feeling? Confusion as to why we were the only walkers in a place like this. David Sillito, BBC News, Stoke-on-Trent.
Time for a look at the weather now with Phil Avery. Hello.
Sophie, thanks very much. I was entertaining a notion about becoming a professional BBC weather watcher earlier on as these glorious images flooded in earlier in the day from quite widely across the northern half of the British Isles. And then Mrs G's image came in and I thought maybe the office doesn't look so bad after all. And you know what? Here's the thing. It's that end of the spectrum of weather that's going to win out this week across the British Isles. There'll be spells of rain. It will get really quite windy and it will become increasingly mild. The first signs of that change already there. We're looking to the Atlantic this week rather than to the continent, which we've done so very often in recent weeks. So there is some sunshine, as you've already seen from the Weather Watcher pictures, across a good part of Scotland, maybe some favoured parts in the north of England too. But as you drift further south and west, it really does go downhill very rapidly indeed. Just watch out for the odd patch of freezing fog, which may just sort of linger on through the day, providing some tricky driving conditions. The odd patch of brightness in the north of England, but once you're much further south than that, well, it's dry for the most part, just about across the east, despite the amount of cloud. It thickens up and lowers in the atmosphere as you come from Northern Ireland to Wales into the southwest of England. Milder, yes, 10 or 11 degrees, but I'm not standing around at it for too long, and I don't suppose you will either. Through the evening and overnight, that band of weather just creeps its way ever further towards the east. It keeps it very mild, but with mist and murk across the southwestern quarter, and it's cool across eastern parts, and that's how you're going to start your Tuesday here. Tuesday, there's no getting away from it. It's going to be a pretty miserable old day. You've got the onshore breeze in the east. That will keep it cool throughout the day, to say the very least, and that rain trying to get a little bit further towards the east. Some heavy pulses of rain in here late on in the day, perhaps coming back into the southwest. Some good news, there's brightness to be had. I think that's an early 10 degrees in Northern Ireland. The temperatures will dip despite the presence of the sunshine. Much of that rain is from a waving weather front. Whenever we say that, the timing of exactly when it moves off into the North Sea, really quite tricky. And there's something of a weather window there between two weather fronts on Wednesday for at least some of you. So if you need a line of washing out, that's probably the best I can probably offer you. Because that weather front out in the west is but the next in the succession of weather fronts that make Thursday a very wet and windy day across western parts. And then as that low pressure moves north, and there's a lot of doubt about this at the moment, it may well be that we bring something potentially really quite stormy into southern parts to finish off the week and indeed take us on into the weekend. Sophie.
Well, thank you. A reminder now of our main story this lunchtime. More than 1.2 million people have now signed a petition calling for President Trump's state visit to the UK to be called off. That's all from the BBC News at 1. So it's goodbye from me on BBC One. We join the BBC's news teams where you are. Bye-bye.